Joined now by Scott Schara. Scott has a really remarkable story to tell about tragedy and compassion in the era of COVID. Scott, thank you for joining us here today.
Well, thanks for having me, Duke.
You had a very, very lovely young daughter named Grace. She seemed like just a ball of energy and enthusiasm. She was a Down syndrome child. Talk about what happened with this otherwise lovely life she was living when COVID reared its face.
So we were on the frontline doctor's protocol. We ended up in the hospital because Grace had a condition that she inherited from me that produces inflammation and clotting. So we ended up in the hospital because she needed oxygen and a steroid. I ended up in the hospital 3 days after Grace died with the same exact situation. So what happened though is once we got in, I want to jump right to the end because that's really what's important in our limited time. So Grace was improving. The last day was unfortunately, the hospital ended up killing her with a combination of meds. So they had her on a med called Precedex for 4.5 days. The package insert for that med says to only use for 24 hours. They had her on it for 4.5 days. By 10:48, the morning of her last day, they ratcheted it up to maximum dose. We get into the last 30 minutes of these dosages. Now she's on a max dose of Precedex. They gave her 2 doses of lorazepam at 5:46 and 5:49 back to back. And then at 6:15, they gave her the lethal dose of morphine. And they did that as an IV push. So Duke, neither of you or anybody could have survived that. We have an intensivist who has written me that said, Scott, the meds killed your daughter. And an intensivist is a doctor that has training in combination of meds. The package insert for morphine says specifically to not combine those meds because it causes death. So that combination of meds was what took Grace out, but the story gets substantially worse. And so I want people to remember this part even more than the meds, because what happened was my daughter Jessica was now an advocate in the room. I was taken out by an armed guard 3 days earlier. She was the replacement advocate. So she's in the room. Grace, after she was given the morphine, started to get cold. She wanted a nurse's help. She said, is this normal? Can you take a temperature? All the nurse did was to give her a blanket and told her that's normal. Well, it's not normal. It's normal if you want to kill somebody. And so then Jessica called Cindy and I, my wife, at 7:20, panicking. She said, Dad, Grace's numbers are dropping. I said, get the nurses in. She said, they won't come in. So we start screaming, save our daughter. Jessica estimated there's 30 nurses in the hall at this point. They would not come in that room. And so the nurses then holler back to us, she's DNR, do not resuscitate. That's the first we knew this. After the fact, we learned that the doctor put a DNR order on our daughter Grace against our wishes. I mean, what would be the reason? Grace had a great day the day before on October 12th, so much so that the doctor called us at 8 o'clock the morning of Grace's last day and wanted to put a feeding tube in to help Grace with nutrition. You know, it's crazy. Jessica found out by running in the hallway then that the doctor had put the order on. The nurse read it off the computer and they said they couldn't do anything about it. So we watched Grace die at 7:27 on FaceTime. And if it couldn't get any worse, it does. So Jessica is telling us what's going on now after the fact. And she said, Dad, there was an armed guard posted outside the room. What's the reason? Was it to prevent a nurse who had a conscience from coming in and saving Grace? The package insert for morphine says to not combine it with those drugs, and they're supposed to have the reversal drug at bedside. They could have saved her just by choice. So people know that the armed guard wasn't just walking by. My daughter Jessica laid with Grace in her bed after she died for 20 minutes, and that armed guard stood outside the nurse's window and watched her the whole time. So they chose to not revive our daughter. After we got to the hospital, Cindy and Jessica cleaned Grace up. I couldn't come in because I had COVID. Our pastor's walking Cindy out in a wheelchair, and one of the nurses bent down to Cindy. She had Grace's things on a cart and said, me and several of the other nurses don't think Grace should have died today.
It's a remarkable story. I mean, let me ask you quickly, were they feeding and hydrating her adequately before that last day, or were they skimping on that as well?
I believe the hydration was fine because she had a bag hooked up with water, and she had a catheter in, so things were working, but the nutrition was lacking. They prevented me from feeding Grace when I was in there. They prevented Jessica from feeding Grace when she was in there, and they only gave her a couple of protein shakes. The reality is Grace could have been fed. I challenged them because they were telling me, well, if we remove the BiPAP mask, Grace's oxygen is going to get too low, which that was not true. I watched them remove it, and they replaced it with a cannula when they would clean Grace's and swab Grace's mouth because it was getting dry. So there's absolutely no reason she couldn't have been fed regularly, and she didn't need a feeding tube at all. But we foolishly agreed to it because we didn't know at that time.
So now, since this has happened, I know that you did everything you can at the hospital to get some answers. Did they stonewall you? How has the hospital handled this with you?
Well, on November 8th, I requested a meeting with the hospital CEO and the doctor, and then we sent them all the research that we had because I believe that was my biblical responsibility. And on December 2nd, they emailed and said, we're not going to meet. They ended up writing a letter dated December 15th that we received on Christmas Eve. And they basically it was a letter of denial with all the things that I had written down, all the things that are now on Grace's website. The details of all the research are on Grace's website.
After the break, I want to come back and talk with you about what's happening now in the wake of her tragic death and what options you have and how can people who are really touched by this story help you out. So we'll be right back in a second. All right, back again with Scott Schara. Scott, the first part of your story is really harrowing, and our prayers to you and your family. First of all, how's everybody holding up with this inexplicable loss? How's the family doing?
It's tough. I mean, I'm the spokesperson for the family, and I'm holding up mainly because God's holding me up. He doesn't fail. My wife is having an extremely hard time, as you can imagine. My daughter Jessica is. She's been my biggest supporter. She reviews everything that I talk about to make sure that I don't make a technical error because we want this information to be accurate.
Well, let's talk first about the do not resuscitate order. We know, and I know, I talked about this at my university classes. We know in the UK there was actually a quiet do not resuscitate order given to all Down syndrome people who came down with COVID. If they ended up in the hospital, it was nationwide, and no one even really knew about it until it came out in the news. Do you suspect there's something like this going on here? I mean, why the do not resuscitate order? Do you, to this day, do you even know how it got put there and why?
That's a great question. I mean, so do I think it happened because Grace had Down syndrome? Personally, yes, I do think that. It's going to be some time to prove it. The things happening in the UK, I think Grace's case is the first time it got caught here. So I believe there's going to be a number of these things exposed as we keep moving. The explanation for the hospital, strangely, they used the doctor's report from that day as their excuse that we approved it, and it's foolishness beyond foolishness because he wrote his report, he dictated his report at 12:57 that day, 12:57 p.m. Grace died at 7:27. So if truly we agreed to a DNR, why didn't you have us sign it? Because that's a legal requirement. A DNR order has to be signed by the patient power of attorney, which was my wife.
Are you hearing from across the country from other families who had Down syndrome COVID victims die? Have you heard? Has anybody reaching out to you?
Yeah, many. It's wonderful. Since we started the website, people are reaching out constantly. I had four reach out just yesterday, and we're updating the website with stories when they allow us to print them on the website.
So we know that the doctors collectively wouldn't talk to you, kind of cowardly. They wrote you what sounds like a form letter to me in which they pretty much denied everything that you asked about. What was the specific denial vis-a-vis the DNR?
Well, they said that the conversation that we had with the doctor the morning that Grace died, that we approved the DNR, which of course we didn't. What we talked about with the doctor was a DNI, do not intubate. they had requested for the 5th time that we give them permission to put Grace on a ventilator just in case she needed it. That was the purpose of the discussion.
For those of you who may be out of state or all across the world, this is in Wisconsin. This is taking place at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Appleton, Wisconsin. You were doing a GoFundMe campaign for this, and tell that story. So money was pouring in to help you fight this battle, and the GoFundMe people pulled the rug right out of you there. What happened then?
2 weeks ago last evening, so 2 weeks ago last Thursday, we got a unilateral email from them just saying that they stopped the GoFundMe because we had prohibited content. So basically we're spreading propaganda, and so that of course goes against the narrative, and they took it down with no right to cure or even talk to anybody. They just took it down.
What's the next step for you? How do they get a hold of more information about what's happening to you?
So ouramazinggrace.net is the website that we have. All of the research is posted there. Grace's life. We have the Give, Send, Go link on that website. So if you want to help that way, we'd love it. If you want to pray for us, that is even more important, because I'm out there every day spreading this message. The thing that we have going on specifically right now is we're working on an event outside of St. Elizabeth's Hospital, a protest rally coming up on April 8th. And so we'll be spreading that word. We have a planning session this afternoon on it. Dr. Artis is flying in for that. Several other people are flying in for that to be speakers. So, I mean, that's exciting stuff.